For years, the crimes of the SS soldiers marked every corner of occupied Europe with horror. They were men who acted with absolute obedience, convinced of an ideology that prepared them not to feel remorse. They participated in massacres, deportations, and systematic executions, always at the service of a regime that collapsed in 1945, leaving behind millions of dead and a country in ruins. But with the fall of the Third Reich, not only were the leaders judged, but the uncomfortable silence of those who remained also began, their wives, their brothers, and above all, their children. Many grew up without knowing the truth. Others faced it all at once, upon discovering who their father had been. How does one live with a legacy like that? The SS, from Hitler's personal guard to the last battle of the Reich. The SS were created by Adolf Hitler in April of 1925 as a small group of personal bodyguards, but over the years, and at the pace of the rise of the Nazi movement, they became an organization with such broad military and police power that they ended up functioning as a state within the state. From 1929 until its dissolution in 1945, the SS was led by Heinrich Himmler, who transformed it from a group with fewer than 300 members to a structure that already exceeded 50,000 at the time. The Nazis came to power in 1933. Himmler, obsessed with concepts of racial purity, personally selected the applicants, although he ended up admitting people from diverse social sectors. Unlike the SA, with their brown shirts and street reputation, the men of the SS wore black uniforms with particular insignia, such as the runic S, the skulls, and the silver daggers, which made them feel part of an elite. When Hitler ordered the elimination of the SA leadership in 1934, with the direct participation of the SS, the latter ceased to be a subordinate organization and came to depend directly on Hitler. Between 1934 and 1936, Himmler and his closest collaborator, Reinhard Heydrich, managed to control all the country's police forces, rapidly expanding the organization's functions. In parallel, their own military units began to be formed, trained like any army unit. By 1939, the SS already had about 250,000 members and a complex internal structure, divided into two major branches, the Allgemeine SS, which dealt mainly with racial and police matters, and the Waffen-SS, which developed as a parallel military corps. Within the Allgemeine SS, one of the most important sections was the Reich Main Security Office, which directed both the criminal police and the Gestapo. It also coordinated the security service in charge of intelligence work inside and outside Germany. For its part, the Waffen-SS was organized into three main groups: Hitler's personal guard, the Skull battalions in charge of the administration of the concentration camps and the slave labor system, and the special purpose troops, which came to form up to 39 divisions during the war and acted as combat units alongside the regular army, known for their discipline and offensive capacity. From the beginning, members of the SS were trained in ideas of racial hatred and were instructed not to show compassion. Their motto was, "Your honor is your loyalty," and their highest priority was to obey Hitler's orders without question. During the war, they were involved in the execution of political opponents, members of ethnic minorities such as Jews and Roma, communist authorities, Polish leaders, partisans, and Soviet prisoners. In the midst of this repressive machinery, and when the Reich was already surrounded on all fronts, Hitler authorized one last desperate offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. That action, which began on December 16, 1944, was Germany's last attempt to stop the Allied advance. German troops, including divisions of the Waffen-SS, made an initial advance thanks to the winter fog that kept enemy aviation at bay, and came to be only a few kilometers from the Meuse River. But the resistance in cities like Bastogne, logistical failures, and the rapid reaction of the Allied forces, led by Patton and Montgomery, halted their momentum. Although the Germans managed to retreat without being completely surrounded, they lost more than 120,000 men and an amount of material that they could never replace. That battle not only marked the failure of their last offensive reserves, but also made it clear to many soldiers that defeat was inevitable. It was the beginning of the collapse. After Germany's defeat, the organization was officially dissolved, and the Nuremberg Tribunal declared it criminal in 1946. But behind all the collaborators, their families remained. What happened to the children of those soldiers? Gudrun Himmler, the daughter who never left the SS legacy. Gudrun Himmler was born in Munich on August 8, 1929. She was the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, supreme head of the SS, and Margarete Boden. Her father was a key figure of the National Socialist regime, organizer of the armed SS, head of the police, and directly responsible for the extermination machinery implemented during the war. But outside the uniform, he was also a father, and he maintained a close relationship with Gudrun. He wrote to her frequently, called her almost every day, and made her travel from Munich to Berlin to visit him. He called her Puppy, her childhood nickname. She accompanied him to official events, including a visit to the Dachau concentration camp. Adolf Hitler, whom she knew as Uncle Adolf, gave her a doll and candy every New Year. During the years of the regime, Gudrun appeared at events with her father, greeted uniformed officers, and posed smiling at party meetings. Himmler's diaries were full of references to her, both in the form of letters and personal notes. The relationship was intense. She admired him deeply, and he sought to be present despite his duties. When the regime collapsed in 1945, Gudrun was 16 years old. Himmler tried to negotiate with the Allied forces, was rejected by Hitler and later captured by British soldiers. Shortly after, he died by poisoning using a hidden cyanide capsule. Gudrun and her mother were arrested by Allied troops in northern Italy. They were moved through detention centers in several countries. While they were held in Rome, Gudrun went on a hunger strike until she became weak. They were later taken to Nuremberg to give testimony, and in November of 1946 they were released, without charges. She would remember that period as the most difficult of her life, stating that they were treated as responsible for her father's actions. Later on, she adopted the surname Burwitz upon marrying Wolf-Dieter Burwitz, a far-right author who became a regional official of the National Democratic Party. They had 2 children. Gudrun never broke with her father's legacy. On the contrary, she constantly defended him, claiming that he had been the victim of a smear campaign. She actively participated in support networks for former SS members, especially in the organization called Silent Help, which offered legal and financial support to former officers. She collaborated on cases like those of Klaus Barbie and Martin Sommer, and maintained contact with a nursing home near Munich. Between 1961 and 1963, she worked as a secretary, using a false name, at the headquarters of the West German intelligence agency. At that time, the institution was directed by Reinhard Gehlen, a former general hired by the United States who incorporated former regime officials for their experience in Eastern Europe. For decades, Gudrun was a recognized figure in circles that maintained links to the past. She attended funerals of former SS members, participated in private meetings, and supported figures like Rudolf Hess. Although she never spoke directly about the Holocaust, she also never acknowledged it. She did not write memoirs or give extensive interviews, but she maintained correspondence with convicts and promoted their defense. The journalist Oliver Schromm described her as a prominent Nazi princess. The theologian Katharina von Kellenbach identified her as a link between former collaborators of the regime and young sympathizers. She was also identified as one of the people who offered financial help to Anton Malloth, a former guard accused of having killed more than 100 prisoners in the Theresienstadt camp. Among the victims was the grandfather of the journalist Peter Finkelgruen. In 2001, Malloth was convicted of those crimes. In her final years, Gudrun lived on the outskirts of Munich. She avoided the media, but was seen at discreet meetings with elderly people who toasted in memory of the past times. For many, she represented a symbolic figure, a silent heiress. She did not participate in public events, but her influence remained present in certain circles. She died on May 24, 2018, at the age of 88, in her home near Munich. Her tomb is simple, with no visible plaques or decorations. Her story is not that of someone who questioned her origin, but of someone who chose to maintain it. While other children of high-ranking officials rejected the past, Gudrun upheld it. She never denied who she was, and instead of moving away, she clung to that legacy as an essential part of her identity. In a society that tried to overcome the horrors of the previous regime, she represented something different, the continuity of a history that others tried to leave behind. Rolf Mengele, the son of the SS doctor who carried a cursed inheritance. Rolf Mengele was born in Germany in 1944, in the middle of the war, when the Nazi regime was already beginning to crumble. During the first years of his life, he believed he was simply one more child, raised by his mother, Irene Schönbein, in an environment where his father's figure was absent. His mother told him that his progenitor had died as a hero in combat, and Rolf grew up convinced of that story. Throughout his childhood, he received occasional news from a certain Uncle Fritz, whom he deeply admired without knowing who he really was. The family environment avoided any clear mention of the past, and so the secret was kept for more than a decade. It was in 1956, when Rolf was 12 years old, that the truth came to light. His mother finally confessed to him that the man he had been writing letters to for years was not his uncle, but his real father. His real name was not Fritz, but Josef Mengele, the SS doctor nicknamed the Angel of Death, known for the cruel medical experiments carried out on prisoners in the Auschwitz concentration camp. This revelation marked a before and after in the life of the young Rolf, who was forced to face not only a new family identity, but also the stigma that came with carrying the Mengele surname. The psychological impact was profound. At school, his classmates began to insult him with nicknames like Criminal, Little Nazi, or SS Mengele. The information about who his father was had spread quickly, and Rolf was exposed to social rejection and humiliation. Despite having lived without any political ideology and oblivious to his father's past, the weight of that surname would accompany him his entire life. The school environment became hostile, and his daily life came to be marked by shame, isolation, and the need to understand a past that had been hidden from him until that moment. The news also altered the dynamic with his father. Although they had never lived together, Josef Mengele tried to establish contact with him and maintain a relationship from exile. In 1977, when Rolf was 33 years old, he agreed to travel to Sao Paulo, Brazil, to be reunited with his progenitor. In that meeting, Rolf met an old man obsessed with his security, always on the defensive, and who lived with the paranoia of being discovered. During his brief visit, Rolf tried to get answers about the role that Josef had played during the Nazi regime. He asked him directly about the Holocaust and the crimes in Auschwitz, but the answers were vague, full of evasiveness, and without any kind of repentance. Rolf later declared that he could never understand how his father had been capable of participating in such atrocious acts. Despite that meeting, the emotional distance between the two was evident, and the bond was never consolidated. Shortly after, in 1979, Josef Mengele died by drowning on a beach near Sao Paulo. The circumstances of his death were ambiguous, but the fact put an end to a life marked by concealment and flight. Upon hearing the news, Rolf traveled to Brazil to retrieve his father's personal belongings, motivated by the desire to protect his family from the media consequences. He feared that the surname would affect the family's business and that his father's moral inheritance would reach them. During the following years, Rolf remained silent. He did not speak publicly about his father or grant interviews. The Mengele family asked him to avoid any media exposure and not to mention the topic again. This silence lasted until 1985, when Rolf decided to break with everything. He granted an interview to the German magazine Bunte, where he told his story for the first time and confessed the impact that discovering his father's identity had had on him. This decision caused a definitive break with the rest of the family, who reproached him for having publicly exposed their history and having affected the family name. After that confession, Rolf took concrete steps to disassociate himself from his legacy. He changed his surname to Jenkel so that his children would not have to bear the same inheritance. He made it clear that his intention was to protect his family and build a life away from the past. For decades, he avoided public prominence and kept a low profile. He did not participate in interviews or media appearances again. However, in 2008, he decided to take another step and publicly asked for forgiveness from the Jewish community for his father's crimes. He expressed his rejection of Nazism and stated his desire to travel to Israel, although he finally discarded the idea out of respect for the Holocaust survivors, fearing that his presence could be offensive to some. In 2017, Brazilian authorities exhumed the remains of Josef Mengele to be used as educational material in forensic medicine courses. When contacted, Rolf refused to travel to Brazil or claim his father's body. He did not want to participate in the process or get involved in matters related to his remains. By then, he had been separated from the public sphere for more than 3 decades and had decided to keep his life completely away from his paternal figure. From a very young age, Rolf had felt a deep shame for his father's actions. The medical experiments that Josef Mengele performed in Auschwitz, especially with twins and children, were a source of horror for him. He knew that his father had injected bacteria into miners, extracted organs, performed dissections without anesthesia, and even sewed 2 children together to try to create conjoined twins. He also knew the history of the selection ramps where his father decided who lived and who died upon arriving at the camps. Those crimes, Rolf explained on several occasions, were contrary to all ethics, and he never found a justification that would allow him to understand them. Although he did not participate in politics or form part of any public movement against Nazism, his silence was a reflection of the rejection he felt. He chose anonymity as a way of distancing himself and protecting his family and friends, aware that his father's history would always haunt him. His life became a silent example of the personal cost of being a descendant of one of the most feared criminals of the Nazi regime. He chose the opposite path to that of figures like Gudrun Himmler or Edda Göring, who defended their fathers or avoided rejecting their legacy. Rolf did it from a distance, without fanfare, but with clear decisions that marked his desire to break with the past. He died away from the media and without seeking notoriety. His story, however, has been cited as a representative case of the burden that the children of high-ranking Nazi officials have had to bear, not because of their actions, but because of those of the ones who preceded them. In the case of Rolf Mengele, that burden was faced with rejection, silence, and finally with a public act of forgiveness. What if my father was right? The story of Horst Wächter. Horst Wächter was born into a family that was an active part of the Nazi system. His father, Otto Wächter, was governor of the Galicia district in occupied Poland and was directly involved in the administration of the Krakow ghetto, as well as in the implementation of measures that favored the mass deportation of Jews to extermination camps. He was part of the SS and was one of Himmler's trusted men, although at the end of the war he fell from grace and went into hiding, helped by members of the Vatican while he tried to flee to South America. He was never brought to trial because he died in Rome in 1949 in circumstances that his son considers suspicious. Decades later, Horst Wächter still keeps a photograph of his father in uniform and a box of memories that he has defended with tenacity. Unlike other children of Nazi leaders who condemned their parents' actions, Horst insists on separating the figure of his father from the criminal apparatus of the Third Reich. In interviews, he has stated that his father was not a criminal, but a patriot forced by circumstances, someone who did what he could in a chaotic system. This stance has generated discomfort in historical circles and in his own family, especially when he has participated in documentaries or public debates where he avoids labeling his father as responsible for war crimes. The tension between the past and his personal vision was powerfully recorded in the documentary My Nazi Legacy, where Horst appears alongside Niklas Frank, son of Hans Frank, in a direct confrontation between 2 opposing ways of processing the legacy of Nazism. While Niklas expresses a resounding rejection and repudiates his father's actions, Horst is uncomfortable, avoids sharp definitions and at times justifies certain acts. Although he admits that there was suffering during the occupation, he insists that his father did not participate in murders, despite the historical evidence that links him to administrative decisions that facilitated the death of thousands. His position has been criticized by many, especially by Holocaust survivors and historians who see his defense as a form of revisionism. However, Horst maintains that his search is not ideological but personal, and that his interest is focused on understanding the man he knew briefly before he died when he was just 9 years old. He has gone so far as to say that he simply wants to know the whole truth, although his interpretation of that truth often minimizes the implications of the position his father held in the regime. Horst Wächter represents one of the most complex expressions of the children of Nazism. He does not fit the profile of the son who breaks with the past, or that of the one who embraces it with pride. His stance is marked by a struggle between family affections and historical responsibilities. The memory he holds of his father is crossed by the figure of an absent man, whose idealized image seems to have weighed more than the official documents, signed orders, or the testimonies of the victims. And even with all that, Horst continues to say that his father was not like the others. that he was not a murderer. Brigitte Höss, childhood next to the death camp. As Christmas of 2021 approached, Brigitte Höss sat in the armchair of her house on the outskirts of Washington. She was 88 years old, with pale lips, thin white hair, slender arms, and a voice weaker than the last time. Even so, her mind was still clear, and her eyes showed some life. Next to her was an old Christmas tree, decorated with ornaments that, decades ago, she had brought from Germany. Some had been made by her mother, Hedwig Höss, when they lived in Auschwitz. Brigitte was the daughter of Rudolf Höss, the camp commander. Thomas Harding, the journalist who was in front of her, had already interviewed her for the first time in 2013. It had taken him 3 years to convince her. Until then, Brigitte had barely said anything about her childhood in the camp, not even to her children. She had never spoken to a journalist. That first interview was transformed into more than 20 hours of recordings and into an article that was spread in many countries. It was the first time that a child of the Auschwitz commander decided to speak. Brigitte told him that she was 7 years old when she arrived with her family at the villa next to the camp in 1940. They lived there until 1944, when they moved to Berlin. In April of 1945, just before the Red Army arrived, her father fled. He posed as a sailor and worked on a farm near Flensburg. Brigitte, her mother, and her brothers hid in a nearby sugar factory. A year later, a British captain was sent to look for her father. That captain was the journalist's own great-uncle Hans Alexander, a German Jew from Berlin. He found Brigitte and the rest in the factory. He yelled so much demanding to know Rudolf's whereabouts that she told him she had headaches for the rest of her life. Thanks to what her mother told her, the captain managed to arrest Rudolf Höss. Later, the journalist wrote a book about that. Brigitte left Germany in the 1950s and moved to Spain. She worked as a model in Madrid for 3 years and met an Irish-American engineer who became her husband. In the mid-70s, they settled in Washington, where she worked for 35 years in a clothing store. Although she had told many things in the first interview, there were details that had remained unanswered. So Thomas returned to her house for one last conversation, just in case there was no other opportunity. The room was in shadow, messy. When he asked her what her first memory was, Brigitte answered without hesitation, Auschwitz. She didn't remember anything from before. She said she was closer to her brother Hans-Jürgen, with whom she had more fun. She went horseback riding with her sister. She slept in the same room as Heidetraud. Klaus and Hans-Jürgen shared another room, and the baby, Annegret, slept in a basket next to a nanny. Even though it seemed like a normal life, Brigitte said that they always knew there was danger. When the alarms for air raids sounded, they ran down to the basement with a suitcase they had ready next to the bed. Their mother would tell them when to go down. Her parents, according to her, loved each other very much. On weekends, her father did not have to go to work, as she called it, and spent time at home. She described him as an excellent father. He smoked a cigar throughout the house on Sundays. They ate together as a family. She assured that at that time they did not know what her father really did for a living. She enthusiastically told how they celebrated Christmas. Her parents would decorate the tree, and then her father would ring a bell. Then he would let them in and they would see the lights, which were real white candles. But before they could approach, they had to have dinner. Afterwards, they could have a few cookies that were hanging on the tree, but only a few. She said that she knew the gardeners and houseworkers were prisoners from the camp. According to Brigitte, they always seemed happy. She assured that the prisoners called her mother the Angel of Auschwitz. It surprised her that this caused a reaction. She replied that her mother was simply a good person, nothing more. In the 1970s, Hedwig went to visit her in Washington. They talked little about the past. Brigitte believed that her mother did know what was happening in the camp, but that she couldn't do anything, and that was why she focused on taking care of her children and her husband. Before being executed in Auschwitz in April of 1947, Rudolf Höss wrote a letter to his daughters Brigitte and Heidetraud. In it, he asked them to take care of their mother and surround her with affection. When the journalist read that letter, Brigitte said that was exactly what she remembered about him, that she loved him, that he had been a wonderful father. She said that he gave them kisses before they went to sleep and wished them good night in German. However, when the conversation touched on the topic of the camp, her tone changed. She said that over time they learned what had really happened, that she didn't like to talk about it, that she didn't believe it was her father's fault, that he didn't know what he had gotten himself into, that he was often a sad man, that her mother had told her that he was very unhappy. The journalist insisted. He asked her how she could say he was a wonderful person if he was responsible for more than 1 million deaths. She hesitated, replied that she didn't see it that way. Then, when he repeated the facts, she admitted that yes, it had happened, that it had been in Auschwitz, that her father was responsible. Even so, she insisted that she didn't want to know certain details, that maybe there were superiors who forced him. Finally, she said yes, she accepted it, but very softly. After that interview, Thomas put away his recorder and said goodbye. Less than 2 years later, in October of 2023, Brigitte died. Her sister Annegret was the only one left alive, but she was just a baby when they lived in the camp. With Brigitte's death, the last direct testimony of what life was like for the Höss family in the house next to Auschwitz also went away. In March of 2024, the movie The Zone of Interest won 2 Oscars. The story showed precisely what Brigitte had told, the daily life in the commander's house, right next to the camp. The movie was released after her death. For that reason, Thomas Harding said he felt grateful to have been able to record those words before it was too late, because for him, they helped to understand how ordinary people could participate in such atrocious acts. Niklas Frank, the son who chose to speak. While many children of figures from the Nazi regime chose to remain silent or deny what happened, Niklas Frank decided to show himself in public and speak directly about his family's history. He was the son of Hans Frank, who held the position of Governor-General in German-occupied Poland, and he did not try to defend his surname or soften the memory of his father. Niklas was born in 1939, and during his early years he lived surrounded by luxury in Krakow, while his father was in charge of the government in those territories. At that time, he did not know the details of what was happening under his father's authority. After the war, things changed. In 1946, Hans Frank was tried in the Nuremberg trials, found guilty of crimes against humanity, and executed. For Niklas, that execution was the starting point of a difficult relationship with his family's past. While other descendants chose to keep their distance or look for excuses, he took another direction. In 1987, he published a book titled The Father, in which he spoke directly about Hans Frank's actions and responsibility. The book caused a great impact in Germany, as it broke with the custom of protecting family members involved in the regime. It was not a common biography. It showed his father as a man interested only in his own benefit, more worried about his position than about political ideas. The work was seen as an unusual example of public distance from the family's past. After the publication, Niklas participated in talks and activities where he made his critical stance on the Nazi past clear. He continued to maintain that vision for years. He did not try to change the family history or diminish what his father had done. His path was not free of criticism. Some people criticized him for making his family's actions public, but others recognized his contribution to the memory of the past. Niklas always said that facing that history was both an individual and a social responsibility, and that forgetting was not an option. Over time, Niklas Frank also told how difficult it had been to grow up with a surname linked to Nazism. He admitted that the relationship with his father, even after he was no longer alive, remained distant, and he never achieved an emotional reconciliation. He spent the last years of his life in Germany. Although he moved away from the media a bit, he continued to support the idea of remembering the historical facts and not minimizing the crimes of the regime. His story shows that some children of the Third Reich chose to face the legacy publicly and critically. He was one of those who decided to put a clear distance between their lives and the actions of their parents, and he chose to follow a different path than others of his same generation. Ricardo Eichmann, From Excavations in Egypt to the Shadow of the Holocaust. Adolf Eichmann, one of the main people responsible for the extermination of millions of Jews, was born in the city of Solingen in 1960. He already held a high position within the SS when the war in Europe began, and he carried out his function with discipline and precision. His main job during the last years of the conflict was to take care of the entire organization of the massive transfers to the extermination camps and to execute the plan to eliminate all the Jews on the continent, as agreed at the Wannsee Conference in 1942. Although he rarely set foot in the camps, Eichmann coordinated from his desk every detail of the deaths that were carried out. When German troops took control of Hungary on March 19, 1944, Eichmann immediately moved to the country to directly apply the so-called final solution. In December of that same year, he escaped from Budapest before the Red Army completely closed access to the city. He returned to Berlin, and there he ordered the destruction of all the papers that would compromise him in the massacres of the Holocaust. As happened with other SS members in the last moments of the war, Eichmann and his family managed to stay safe in Austria when Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Even so, he was soon after caught by American soldiers and spent time in different detention centers for SS officers. He used a false identity with the name Otto Eichmann. He managed to escape from a work group in the town of Cham, Germany, after finding out that someone had revealed his real name. By then, Rolf Höss had already begun to testify at the Nuremberg trials and had directly pointed him out as the person in charge of planning the Holocaust. Eichmann understood that he had to disappear as soon as possible. In 1948, he got papers to live in Argentina and false documents with the name Ricardo Clement, thanks to a network run by Bishop Alois Hudal. He followed the path of the convents until he reached Italy, and from there he left for Argentina, where he settled in a residential area of Buenos Aires called Olivos. Under his new identity, he began to work at the Mercedes-Benz factory, and over time he rose to the position of section chief. His wife and his 3 children, Klaus, Nicholas, and Horst Adolf, joined him shortly after in that same place. There a new stage began. He never talked about the past or mentioned his role in the genocide because he knew that the Israeli secret services were looking for him in every corner of the world. In 1955, he had one more son, whom he named Ricardo, as was customary in the country. When that boy was just 5 years old, Mossad agents kidnapped Eichmann and took him to Jerusalem to be tried for crimes against humanity, in an operation known as Garibaldi. No one explained to little Ricardo why his father had disappeared. He later learned that he was executed and that his ashes were thrown into the Mediterranean Sea. Over the years, he discovered in history books that his father had been one of the main people responsible for the crimes committed during the war. He found it difficult to accept that his father had led a completely different life in Germany, where he was responsible for so many deaths. But the more he learned, the greater the rejection he felt towards him and his decisions. Ricardo studied prehistory, classical archaeology and Egyptology at the University of Heidelberg during the 1970s. He chose to specialize in ancient Egyptian culture and participated in various excavations in that region, not far from the site where his father was executed. He has not given many interviews throughout his life, but on the few occasions that he has spoken with the press, he has made it clear that he does not share the ideology that his father defended. Today, he is a prominent researcher in his field, and for 25 years he held the directorship of the Oriental Department at the German Archaeological Institute based in Berlin between 1996 and 2020. In 1995, he agreed to talk with Zvi Aharoni, the Mossad agent who managed to locate his father and who participated directly in his capture. There are no public details about what they talked about, but Ricardo later stated that that meeting left a deep impression on him. Heinrich, Elke and Silke Peiper, the silent legacy of the most feared SS officer. Joachim Peiper was one of the most celebrated and feared officers of the Waffen-SS. He was among Heinrich Himmler's protégé and worked directly as Himmler's personal aide before becoming a combat commander. He was a fervent believer in Nazi ideology and rose quickly through the SS ranks for his fanaticism, his closeness to high-ranking officers, and his brutality. As commander of the 1st Armoured Regiment of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division, he participated in multiple military operations during the Second World War, including the invasion of France, the campaign on the Eastern Front, and the Ardennes offensive. During the latter, his unit was involved in the Malmedy massacre, where dozens of American prisoners of war were executed. After the war, Peiper was tried for war crimes at the Dachau trials and sentenced to death, although his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, and he was then released on parole after serving little more than a decade. Despite his background, he never showed remorse or acknowledged responsibility for the crimes committed by his men. After being released from prison, he settled with his family in West Germany and years later moved to the south of France, where he lived a low profile until his assassination in 1976, after being discovered by anti-fascist groups who set fire to his house while he slept. Joachim Peiper had 3 children with his wife Sigurd Hinrichsen, who had worked as Himmler's personal secretary and remained faithful to the National Socialist cause even after the collapse of the regime. The three children, Hinrich, Elke and Silke, grew up in an environment conditioned by their father's figure and by the shadow that the Peiper surname had been dragging since the post-war period. During the years after Joachim's release, the family lived in West Germany and tried to lead a relatively private life, although in circles close to former SS members and sympathizers of the Third Reich. The mother maintained a firm position in defense of her husband and never publicly renounced his ideas or his past as a high-ranking Nazi official. Hinrich Peiper, the eldest son, was the one who spent the most time with his father after his release. Being a teenager when Joachim was released, he witnessed up close the family's most tense years, including the move to Traves in France, where his father tried to lead a quiet life surrounded by books and memories of his time as a soldier. Hinrich did not adopt any public stance regarding his father's legacy, and there are no records of his statements about the crimes for which Joachim was convicted. He lived away from the media, and no outstanding professional activity is known to be associated with his name. Like his sisters, his life was discreet, without public interventions or ideological manifestations. Elke Peiper, the middle daughter, grew up in an environment of silence and denial. Although she spent her childhood surrounded by military photographs and nostalgic stories about the past, she never offered public testimony or granted interviews about her family. There is no evidence that she was part of extremist movements or that she tried to publicly vindicate her father's role in the war. Her name only appears in civil registries and family documents, but it is not listed in any publication related to the legacy of Nazism or with the defense or condemnation of Joachim Peiper's past. Like her siblings, she remained away from any public or media activity. Silke Peiper, the youngest, was barely a child when her father was assassinated in France. Her memory of him was formed through her mother's narrative and the family environment that preserved Joachim's image as a loyal soldier. Over the years, Silke also did not speak publicly about her father's past or offer statements to the media or researchers. No links are known of her to political organizations or associations of former SS members. She lived her adult life out of the media spotlight, leaving no relevant public records beyond those of her family. Like her siblings, she chose silence as a way of life in the face of the weight of the Peiper surname. The three siblings grew up with the mark of a father considered a war criminal, in a family that never renounced the past, and in a country that was trying to rebuild itself without looking back. None of them chose to break the silence or to make a critical or distant stance public regarding their paternal legacy. Unlike other descendants of SS officers who chose to confront the family past, Joachim Peiper's children decided to preserve their privacy and maintain a life away from the historical or political debate. Their case shows an example of a silent inheritance, where history is preserved in the domestic sphere and the surname is carried without exposure, without condemnation or vindication, simply as a fact not to be talked about. Jorge Priebke, bearing the surname of an executioner. During the war, Erich Priebke was an SS officer with the rank of captain and had been part of the Gestapo in Rome, where he was directly involved in the Fosse Ardeatine massacre, a collective execution in which 335 people died, many of them civilians. After the conflict, he managed to escape and adopted a new identity in Argentina, where he lived for decades in the city of Bariloche. It was there that he started a family, married Alicia Stoll, and they had 2 sons, one of them named Jorge. While his father led a quiet life as a school principal, hiding his past, the children grew up in a relatively normal environment, not knowing at first the exact details of what their father had done during the war. When in the 1990s Erich was finally identified, captured and extradited to Italy to be tried, his family involuntarily became the center of attention. Jorge, the eldest son, publicly defended his father and denounced what he considered a belated persecution. In interviews granted to Argentine media, he held versions that tried to justify the context of the orders received by officers like his father, and on one occasion, when it was debated where to bury him after his death, he went so far as to say with sarcasm that they should bury him in Israel, because maybe that way they would be at peace, a phrase that was harshly criticized. That reaction showed how the legacy of many SS members continued to deeply mark their descendants, not only because of the historical inheritance, but also because of social pressure, the stigma, family divisions, and the way each one faced guilt, responsibility, or denial. Jorge was not part of the Nazi apparatus, nor was he involved in crimes, but his life was defined by the figure of his father. Unlike other children who chose silence or rejection, he chose to maintain a firm defensive position, which distanced him from the more usual line of self-criticism adopted by other descendants. Years later, when Erich Priebke died under house arrest, there were discussions about his burial, protests, and no cemetery in Rome wanted to accept the body. His son intervened again, and those statements again had repercussions, reopening the debate about memory, forgiveness, and the role of the children of those who were part of the SS. Klaus-Georg Altmann, the son who never renounced the butcher of Lyon. Klaus-Georg Altmann was born into a family marked by the institutional violence of the Third Reich. His father, Klaus Barbie, was an SS officer and head of the Gestapo in Lyon during the German occupation in France. He was known for his brutality in the persecution of the French resistance, the systematic torture of prisoners, and the deportation of Jewish children, especially in the case of the raid on the Isieux home. At the end of the war, Barbie managed to escape trial thanks to the clandestine routes used by many SS members and took refuge in Bolivia under the false name of Klaus Altmann, where he rebuilt his life with the help of anti-communist networks and the collaboration of foreign intelligence services. It was in Bolivia that his son Klaus-Georg grew up, in an environment that carefully hid the father's real past and avoided any direct mention of his crimes. Unlike other children of Nazi leaders, Klaus-Georg did not break the bond with his paternal figure or adopt a critical stance over time. On the contrary, during the years when his father was discovered and subsequently extradited to France in the 1980s, Klaus-Georg appeared publicly on several occasions to defend him. When Barbie was subjected to trial for crimes against humanity, his son was present at the legal process, stating to the media that his father was not guilty of the atrocities attributed to him. According to his own words, Barbie's image had been distorted by propaganda and political interests, and he considered that the accusations did not conform to the truth about the man he knew in the family sphere. During the trial in Lyon, which attracted international attention due to the seriousness of the charges and the number of victims involved, Klaus-Georg maintained a constant attitude of support. He did not express empathy for the testimonies of the survivors or acknowledge his father's responsibility in the repressive operations of the Gestapo. For him, Klaus Barbie had been an obedient officer, part of a historical context in which decisions had to be understood as military acts, not as deliberate crimes. At no time did he adopt a stance of critical review or show himself willing to dialogue with the victims. Even after the conviction, his position did not change. He rejected the sentence as an act of selective justice motivated by the politics of the victors. After Klaus Barbie's death in prison in 1991, Klaus-Georg did not publicly change his story. He stayed in Bolivia for periods, away from political life and without exposing himself in new forums, but without retracting the statements he had offered during the trial. He was never seen participating in activities related to the memory of the Holocaust, nor did he offer apologies or reflections on the impact of his paternal legacy. He also showed no intention of changing his surname or symbolically distancing himself from the past. Unlike other descendants of Nazi criminals who opted for silence, internal exile, or the active denunciation of the horror, he chose to maintain the family bond and deny the validity of the judicial processes that condemned his father. There are no records of him having written memoirs, participated in documentaries, or granted later interviews that revealed an evolution in his thinking. His attitude towards history was to preserve a private image of the father as a respectable figure, detached from the criminal dimension established by justice. Even in the years after the trial, he avoided making statements, but he also did not retract or express doubts about the defense he had made. His story represents one of the most firm positions of denial or relativization within the group of children of SS officers, and it contrasts with those who, when faced with the past, chose other ways of assuming it. In the case of Klaus-Georg, the bond with his father remained intact until the end, without changes, without ruptures, and without any acknowledgement of the pain caused. After listening to the voices of these children and seeing how each one faced their history in such different ways, it becomes clear that the past is not erased when a war ends. Some grew up admiring their fathers without knowing what they had done. Others fled from their surnames, from their memories, from the hidden photographs. There were those who denied everything until the end, and also those who chose to speak in public, seeking to understand, denounce, or simply release the weight they were carrying. There is no single way to live with such a legacy. What remains is the evidence that the inheritance of the Third Reich did not end with its leaders. It continued in the homes, in the silences, in the conversations that were never had. This documentary does not try to justify or condemn or give answers. It only shows what happened later when the world was trying to rebuild itself. But the scars remained open in those who had not wielded a weapon but carried a surname stained with blood. Because after the fall of an empire, there are also those who were born in its shadow.